what's wrong with Reagan? Well, fucking everything. He was genuinely awful. I've been meaning to talk about how much Reagan sucks, but he sucks so bad I can't fit it all in one video. So this will be an inconsistent mini-series on why everybody hates Reagan. Let's get this one kicked off with a big one that never seems to get talked about. You know when you pull up to a stoplight and you just try to do everything you can do to avoid eye contact with that person standing on the corner holding a cardboard sign? Well, that awkward moment has been brought to you by Ronald Reagan. Yep, homelessness in the US is almost exclusively Ronald Reagan's fault. And this especially includes all those homeless veterans that conservatives pretend to care about every time they're trying to justify their hatred for helping, immigrants or foreign allies, but then always vote to cut legislation that currently helps them and vote against any legislation that would actually help them. Then every time you hear about a mass killing or attempted mass killing or a terror attack, that's also Reagan's fault for the same reason that homelessness is Reagan's fault, and also for other reasons that are still Reagan's fault, but we'll have to get into in a different video. Now, I'm sure we've all heard that people who are part of the party of personal responsibility, blaming shit that's their fault on other people, point to places like California to show why homelessness is not their fault. Sure, homelessness is pretty bad in California, and part of that is just basic geography and population density. California has, moderate weather that makes it easier for people to survive without a home, and not freeze to death. California also has the most people, and when you have the most people, you have more people that are going to be homeless, and you're also going to have more resources that homeless people can utilize to not die. To really get down to the root problem of why California has such a bad homelessness problem, we need to go back in time to 1967. Now, does anybody remember what job Ronald Reagan had in between being a shitty D-list actor and one of the worst presidents in American history? Anybody? Bueller? That's right, governor of California. As governor of California, most of the shitty things people associate with California are his fault, and this is no exception. In 1967, he signed the Lanterman-Petrus Short Act. This law made it more difficult for California to hospitalize, institutionalize, and medicate mentally ill people. As a result, patients got kicked out of the mental hospitals quite literally, and it made it exponentially more difficult for them to get back in. Group houses and boarding houses picked up some of the slack, but they were not focused on treatment or long-term care. Mentally ill people being forced into the justice system increased 50% within a year. And as a result, Reagan ended up hand-building a revolving door where people went from the streets to the justice system to group houses or boarding houses back out onto the street. On a national level, through the 1970s, the federal mental health system had been struggling as well. This was in part due to just legislative neglect over the years, and an influx of soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War who were needing new and complex treatments as a result of the trauma during their service. To address these issues, the president we needed but didn't deserve, Jimmy Carter, signed the Mental Health Systems Act of 1980, designed to fix a lot of the issues in our mental health system and get people the help that they needed. We thanked him for his efforts by replacing him with the devil incarnate that same year. Now, having a model of the absolute train wreck his legislation could do on a state level, he said, you know what, we should do that on a federal level, but worse. And before the ink had even dried on Carter's Mental Health Systems Act, Reagan repealed it in the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1981. Then he's like, kicking all the mentally ill people out onto the street is great and all, but what about all this pesky public housing funding? Some of these gross mentally ill people could maybe use that to not live in a van down by the river, and we can't have that, so why don't we go ahead and cut another $17.5 billion from that program as well? Like, the shit was needlessly cartoonishly evil. It's so cartoonishly evil, you can't even argue that this is about fiscal responsibility, because it's over 20% cheaper for the American taxpayer to house and give homeless people mental health care than it is to leave them homeless. And that's just a direct cost to taxpayers, with homeless people getting caught up in the judicial system and the cost for law enforcement to have to deal with these problems. That doesn't factor in the economic problems that homelessness causes, like how areas with high homelessness affect businesses and property values and tourism, and the fact that a lot of these people could be productive, contributing members of society if we just gave them the right help. And yeah, Reagan was a dementia-riddled moron, but it's not like they didn't know that this was the case. Because thanks to him fucking everything up in California, we already had the blueprints to how shitty, expensive, and ineffective this system was. So when I say this was cartoonishly evil, literally the only motivation for this dog shit legislation was to punish mentally ill poor people and veterans. And do it at a higher expense to your fucking tax dollars. Now that we've covered why homelessness is pretty much exclusively Ronald Reagan's fault, and every time you see a homeless person, it should remind you to hate Ronald Reagan a little bit more. Well, that's homelessness, but what about mass killings? A person who will probably need crayons for me to explain further if they haven't connected the dots already might ask. The answer is that mentally unstable people do mentally unstable things when they don't get the help they need. Like in 1984, a California man named James Huberty called and tried to get himself committed to a mental institution and was turned away the day before he walked into a McDonald's and killed 22 people and injured 19 more, making it the worst mass shooting to date at the time. Or in 1986, when a man named John Hinckley Jr. in a deranged attempt to impress Jodie Foster almost saved America. If only he had taken some shooting lessons or picked a bigger caliber. The overall effect of this involves some conjecture because mass killings are so statistically rare that they're really impossible to quantify with any solid correlation or causation. In fact, you are more likely to die by being executed by the state than you are to die in a mass shooting. But it is undeniable fact that some of these violent events would have been avoided had Reagan not gutted mental health institutions, along with some other policies that we'll get into in some other videos. Not to mention suicide rates, drug-related crime and overdoses, domestic abuse, and police interactions that turn violent all happen more frequently with a underfunded mental health care system. However, a lot of those things were also made worse by other Reagan policies, which we'll get into in future videos. But the fact that you feel uncomfortable every time you walk through an area with a high homeless population, and the fact that you're getting charged extra to feel that way, and the fact that that's all Reagan's fault, should be reason enough to hate him. But if it's not, don't worry, there's plenty more reasons why everybody hates Reagan.